while that of polling officers will be concluded on 20 July 2018. Recruitment of the electoral staff is done in terms of Section 10 of the Electoral Act, which directs ZEC to recruit from the Public Service Commission, parastatals, local authorities, and the Health Services Board. It is important to note that in order to allow those on electoral duties to vote on polling day, the Commission has facilitated postal votes for some, while others will be deployed in areas they were allocated polling stations when they registered as voters. In terms of Chiefs Council elections, the provincial assemblies of chiefs shall meet at provincial centres on 11 July 2018 to elect members of the Council of Chiefs. The elected Council of Chiefs will meet at Mukwati Building in Harare on 18 July 2018 at 10 o'clock in the morning for the purpose of electing the President and the Deputy President of the Council of Chiefs, who shall be ex officio senators. The Commission has established a total of 10,985 polling stations throughout the country. The list of polling stations has been published in today's press and will again be published on polling day. The law compels the Commission to establish adequate polling stations in each of the country's 1,985 wards, with each polling station being located at a place that is readily accessible to the public, including persons with physical disabilities. However, Section 51, subsection 1b of the Electoral Act prohibits the establishment of polling stations in the following areas: premises owned or occupied by a political party or candidate, or in a police station, barrack, cantonment area, or other place where police officers or members of the defence forces are permanently stationed, or premises licensed under the Liquor Act. So we obviously can't have a polling station at a nightclub, for instance, or any place which for any reason may give rise to reasonable apprehension on the part of voters as to the secrecy of their vote or the integrity of the electoral process. The Commission would like to inform the public and all stakeholders that it is not necessarily true that all registration centres that were set up during the voter registration exercise will become polling stations during the 2018 harmonised elections. Some registration centres were just set up to facilitate ease of voter registration. This will hopefully address false reports circulating on social media about a polling station allegedly located within a cantonment area in Zuarasi. The Zimbabwean law has provisions for election observers but we don't have any provisions for election monitors. To date, the Commission has accredited 830 election observers for the impending harmonised elections. The accreditation process will continue up to the election day. Observers are reminded of the need to follow the Observers' Code of Conduct, which compels them to obey every lawful instruction by an electoral officer, desist from hindering or obstructing an electoral officer from the lawful conduct of his or her functions, desist from wearing any apparel, sporting or prohibited symbol or apparel indicating any affiliation with a candidate or political party participating in the poll, nor in any other way canvass for any candidate or political party while observing the poll. There are a lot of other do's and don'ts for election observers, which I've taken the trouble to put down again in my weekly brief, which you can read for yourself. We would like to remind observers that they are not allowed to attend multi-party liaison committee meetings, unfortunately, but can only do so upon consensus among committee members. In the event that they are allowed to attend, observers are not allowed to record those proceedings. The purpose of those proceedings really is to build consensus between political players around contentious issues. The Commission and all electoral officers shall take all steps necessary to ensure that accredited observers are able to exercise their functions. In conclusion, I would like to say that the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission is taking steps towards ensuring that the elections will be conducted peacefully in an environment that ensures that the will of the electorate prevails. We are satisfied as a Commission, and as you can see today, we have the full Commission. Welcome, Commissioner Mshonga.
Thank you.
We are satisfied that our preparations are well on course, and we are satisfied that we are ready to discharge our mandate in accordance with the law. Thank you very much for listening to me. Now I'll allow Mr. Manyao to facilitate question and answer.
Please identify yourselves.
organization that you're working for?
No questions?
No, there's one there.
My name is David from AFK News Agency. Chairperson, there was a time you held a press conference and asked about who's printing the ballot papers, and you said it was a regional company. And you're surprised that the elite is doing that. Why were you dishonest? The second question is on that.
I'll allow you one question only because others also have questions to ask. Now, that is a very serious charge to make before a chairperson of an electoral commission, which is actually set up in terms of our constitution, and not only a chairperson but as a judge. First thing I would like to say is I was not dishonest, and I want to ask you, why were you not listening? Because what I said, and I'll repeat it, was we have procured the ballot paper from a regional company, and we did procure the ballot paper from a South African company whose name and details we shall publish in accordance with the law when we've actually finished it. Next question.
Yes.
My name is Blessed Mfano. I'm with the Newsday. Justice Chigumba, in the last press briefing that you held 2 weeks ago, you said that you categorically stated that all names had been put in the voters' roll at that particular time because you had finished decryption. But your report now is that mere repetition? Because I think it was on the 18th of July. You stated that on the 18th of June, rather, you had finished all decryption and all names were on the voters' roll. And my question now is this repetition, and do the voters' roll that you release have those names that you have decrypted?
You're quite correct. It was mere repetition. It was reassurance to Zimbabweans, and the voters' roll which we released on the 18th is the same voters' roll which we are going to polling with.
Yes. Any more questions? Oh, sorry. Oh, okay. Give him the mic. Right here.
Good afternoon. My name is Valentine Maponga. I'm a freelance journalist. From the list of polling stations that were published in the newspapers today, I noticed that there are now 10,985 polling stations. Up from the initially announced 10,807. I just want to know, from my understanding, that people were registered to vote and were allocated polling stations when they registered. So who is going to be voting for the new polling station that we have added? Thank you.
Thank you very much for asking me that question, because it actually gives me an opportunity to clarify certain things. When we started the registration or the making of a new list with the biometric voter registration exercise, we actually started with polling station mapping. And I've said this before. In 2016, we did polling station mapping, and in 2017, we actually started registration. Now, having done the registration and coming to the end of that process, we then realized that we had some polling stations which were oversubscribed. And by oversubscribed, I mean certain polling stations had more than 5,000 registered voters. We then made a recommendation to Parliament through the Ministry of Justice to say, could we have an amendment of the law which would allow us to create sub-polling stations within those polling stations which we had already mapped, in order to avoid having long winding queues on polling day. And that amendment, you know the date when the electoral amendment bill was actually passed, it was fairly recently. It then gave us permission to say, look, you've already mapped your polling stations, but we're giving you permission to create sub-polling stations. So what we basically did is, if we had a polling station which we'd already mapped as polling station A, and that polling station A had 5,000 registered voters, we then created 5 sub-polling stations within the same premises of polling station A to say we now have A1, A2, A3, A4, and A5, and each sub-polling station will have a maximum of 1,000 registered voters. This is purely administrative in order to avoid long winding queues of the past. So what you're going to find is You will have been allocated your polling station as A, but your polling station might now have sub-polling stations. This has resulted in a slight increase of our traditional polling stations. I hope I've answered you well.
Next question. Where's the mic? There's somebody there.
Sarah Sinatra from Algeria. Justice, about 2 weeks, 3 weeks before an election, we're still getting other political parties saying you're not being fair for this election. We are hearing NPC will be marching here later on in the week because they failed to observe you while you're printing the ballot. What do you say to this, Justice?
Perhaps I'll allow Commissioner Dr. Moyo to field this question because he was the one who was actually present during the observation of the printing of the ballot paper.
The political parties were given an opportunity to observe the printing of the ballot paper, but the political parties were allowed to observe the printing of the ballot paper. Yeah. The political parties were indeed allowed to observe the printing of the ballot paper at Fidelity Printers, in which they saw it from the gallery side. The requirements of the printing regulations at Fidelity Printers are that when you do the observation, you do it from a printing gallery. So they did get an opportunity to observe from that distance. But what we later then heard from the parties is that they wanted to actually to be involved in the process of touching the ballot, in the process of also getting with the printing press, things that are not allowed in terms of the law. We also want to remind the people of Zimbabwe that the prerogative of printing of the ballot lies with the Commission. The process of allowing parties to go in and observe was a way of trying to find consensus and the common ground with political parties so that we can minimize on conflict. And we did do our duty that way. We can't go beyond that. That would be unlawful.
Next question. There's one here. Okay.
Yes, I'll take that one.
Good morning. My name is Violet Bonda. I'm a freelance journalist. Just going back to the earlier question about the names that are appearing on the voters' roll. I understand that there are thousands with the same name that are appearing on the voters' roll. Can you tell us how many exactly are removed? And also, are you now going to have pictures and fingerprints for all those names that the opposition has said are suspect? And also on the issue of the ballot paper, who's going to be transporting the ballot papers to the polling station? Is it the military? Can you just tell us the process of how that's going to be done?
The number of people whose names have been placed on the exclusion list is a couple of hundred. It's 800 or 900. I can't exactly say off the top of my head today without being accused of being dishonest next week. So I'll say a couple of hundred have been excluded, but if you'd like a copy of the exclusion list, it's readily available from our ICT department. Thousands, hundreds with similar names. There are some people who have similar names. There are some people who have anomalies in their identity documents. We have referred those people to the Registrar General's office because the Registrar General is the one who has the mandate of registering people. At the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, when we register voters, we must assure ourselves that every registered voter is eligible to be registered to vote. And part of being eligible is being able to prove that you're a Zimbabwean citizen. Now, if there's something wrong, a problem, a correction that you need to do with your ID, we exclude you from the list because it means you're not eligible to be registered to vote as long as your ID documents have not been corrected. The reason why we exclude them is so that they go to the Registrar General, correct their IDs for whatever anomaly, and then they can actually re-register and be included in the next voters list. So yes, there are some people with similar names. If you'd like to see for yourselves, get a copy of the exclusion list. They're there on the exclusion list. It's not a secret. We will not be releasing pictures of voters to the public. And this is because, as I have said, the right to access information is not absolute. It must be juggled with the right to privacy. So the format in which we have released the voters' roll, the information that we have given on the voters' roll is sufficient to fulfill our constitutional mandate that we must provide a final voters' roll which is analyzable and which is searchable. The information that is there on the voters' roll assists anyone who would like to analyze our voters' roll to do so without impinging on other people's rights to privacy. So we will not be releasing pictures. I believe there was another aspect of the question. Who will transport the ballot papers? It will certainly not be the military. It will be the printers. And the law then says that we must publish in the press, when we finish printing, the names of the printers, the number of ballot papers that they've printed, and the number of surplus ballot papers. We will also, at each polling station, when the ballot papers actually reach the polling stations, you will find, and I would like to encourage those who have election agents to actually send their election agents to our training sessions where they can actually be trained together with our staff on election procedures. The election procedure is that when the ballot paper is actually delivered to the polling station, this is the stage where the polling officer actually calls all the observers and all the election agents to say, look, we've received 5 ballot papers, and the ballot papers will have serial numbers. Each person present there will be allowed to take down the serial number. At the end of polling, those serial numbers will actually, those persons present will actually be allowed again to take serial numbers of the surplus ballot paper. So there are measures in place, and I would like to encourage Zimbabweans to say, when we release information about our training schedules, it might be prudent to actually attend some of them so that you actually also understand the procedures which are employed at polling stations. So certainly serial numbers of ballot papers, sealing of ballot boxes, accountability for the ballots that are used, accountability for spoiled ballots, accountability for surplus ballots, that is certainly usually done at polling station level in this jurisdiction. I understand in some jurisdictions they have a different way of doing things where stakeholders are allowed to, as Commissioner Dr. Moyo was saying, touch the ballot paper and feel it and all this sort of thing. But in those jurisdictions where that sort of thing is done, there's legislative framework for that.
Next question.